Okay, well, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to another Center for Global Higher Education webinar. Today we are joined by Professor Anju Mary Paul, and she is a professor of social research and public policy at New York University in Abu Dhabi. She'll be presenting her recent work on migration patterns in and out of the UAE, entitled Dangerous Destinations, How Gendered Security Concerns Shape South Asian Expatriate Parents' University Destination Decisions. Before I hand over to Anju, just for the audience, some general housekeeping, and we have presenters speak for a good 20-30 minutes or so, and then when they're finished, we invite the audience to engage in some discussion and put their questions to the presenter. So in order to do that, while Anju is wrapping up, maybe towards the end of her talk, if you could put your thoughts or questions into the chat function, that way we can kind of queue up your questions and then call on you individually to ask them to Anju. When we do, we'll ask you to unmute and turn on your camera if you like, and then you can ask Anju directly, and we'll take it from there. So I think that's all we need to say, housekeeping wise. Very happy to have Anju here today. Thank you very much for sharing your exciting work. So we're looking forward to it. So over to you, Anju.
Thank you so much, Lee. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, fantastic.
Yep.
So let me just start by thanking the Center for Global Higher Education for inviting me to give this talk, to David and also Chris for handling all of the logistics, and really a special thanks to Lee, whom, again, this is the first time that we're meeting in person, but his work on the UAE was really important to me when I was starting out this project. So it's nice to be able to kind of present it back to him and get his thoughts. Let me also just give a shout out to my co-author, Sanam Parwani. She was a former student of mine at NYU Abu Dhabi. And really, we started this project together and were fully equal partners in this paper. She's not here today, but she's with us in spirit. So this is not going to be new news to any of you, but just in case, let me just remind you all that the volume of international student migration has been increasing steadily over the last few decades, while the gender gap in international student migration has also been steadily narrowing. In 2021, which is the latest year that we had global data on, it was at 47% female versus 53% male international student migrants. But this gender gap actually varies significantly by origin country, and several studies out of South Asia have shown that student migrant flows out of particular South Asian countries, particularly India and Pakistan, have retained a persistent gender gap. And this gap has been linked partly to the patriarchality of South Asian families, where they invest much more in their sons' education compared to their daughters, but also to parents' gendered concerns about their daughters' safety if they're sending their daughters to study overseas on their own. Now, the second reason, this idea of concerns about their daughter's safety, is somewhat ironic, given that Indian female college students, when they study domestically, are oftentimes having to deal with a variety of safety concerns in country itself, ranging from catcalling to lewd remarks to inappropriate sexual contact to even sexual violence. As such, studying in either this origin country or overseas could perhaps appear to present safety concerns as far as the parents of South Asian female students are concerned. And so it was given this paradox that we wanted to ask this question, that when studying in either the origin country or overseas may appear to present safety concerns, how do South Asian expatriate parents who are living out of their origin country navigate the university destination decision process for their daughters? Now, we explored that question using the case study of the United Arab Emirates. And for those of you who are not familiar with the UAE, this is a very high income country in the Gulf. There are no official statistics on the distribution of migrants in the country, but unofficially, the estimate is that about 85% of the population, give or take, is foreign. And of the overall population in the country, an estimated 65% is South Asian, with Indians being the single largest source country at about 4 million, according to the Indian Embassy in the UAE. Now, most South Asians working in the UAE are in blue-collar occupations, but the Indian Embassy estimates that about 15% of Indians in the country, which is about 600,000 people, are in white-collar professions or are business owners, and who are earning sufficiently high income that they are able to sponsor their families to live with them in the UAE. Most South Asian migrant workers are there on their own. They're not able to bring their families with them. But the 600,000 expatriates, if we use that very classed label, are often living in the UAE with their spouses and children. And there's a lot of work that's been done to show how appealing the UAE is to South Asian expatriates. It offers them geographical proximity to their home countries. It also offers significant cultural resonance because of the long-standing South Asian communities that have been living in the Gulf for decades. The zero income taxes, the high standard of living, the high levels of public safety, all of these make the UAE a very attractive place for South Asian expatriates. But on the downside, these expatriates understand that they are constantly going to be on a temporary visa. There is no substantive pathway to naturalization that's available to almost all migrants in the country, and so they exist in a state of permanent temporariness. And this sense of permanent temporariness inevitably affects how South Asian expatriate parents weigh university choices for their UAE-raised children. They have to decide whether or not they should send their children out of the country to give them a sense of permanence, perhaps back home in their origin countries, a sense of rootedness and belonging, or they could potentially consider sending them to a third country, such as in the West, where they might be able to secure permanent residence and maybe even citizenship. Or the third option is that they keep them in the UAE on a student visa, for instance. Now, this issue about the UAE as a university destination has become more and more pertinent in recent years because the UAE government has been investing significantly in trying to build the country's knowledge-based economy, trying to diversify away from oil. And so it has invested significantly in its higher education sector in recent decades. There are presently over 100 institutions of higher education in the country, most of them being private. And interestingly enough, the UAE hosts the second highest number of international branch campuses in the world, coming second only after China, which is really quite incredible when you think about the differing populations of these two countries. Now, the majority of these IBCs, sorry, this is.
Carry on, sorry, I've muted them.
Okay, thank you. So the majority of these IBCs are affiliated with Western universities, but there are also several IBCs affiliated with Indian universities. There's one from a Pakistani university. In fact, one of the most recent universities to set up a branch campus in the UAE was the prestigious IIT Delhi University, which started admitting students into its brand new first ever international campus in Abu Dhabi in 2024. As such, for South Asian expatriate parents, they're really quite spoiled for choice. They can send their child, even sending their child to a campus in the UAE has become an increasingly viable option because it can still give them a degree linked to a Western university or a university in their origin country. And much like Lee's work, our own research has revealed that the UAE is very attractive for several reasons. In a separate paper that we have forthcoming, we found the four main reasons being the improved quality and variety of degrees that are available from UAE universities, the varying price points to match different household budgets, the greater safety and comfort that is signified by sending your child to a UAE university, and importantly, this reframing of pursuing undergraduate studies in the UAE as simply deferring their child's stepwise migration to the West by just a few years. And so in their negotiation with their children, oftentimes parents are saying, look, you can do your master's degree in the West, but do your undergraduate degree in the UAE instead. But in that particular paper, we didn't talk about how gender might shape South Asian parents' ideas about different destination options. And that's what we wanted to do with this paper. And just to kind of give you a sense as to just a snapshot of some of the international branch campuses in the UAE. These are just some of the logos of those universities. And like I said, there's many, many more. So in terms of the issues around safety, as I mentioned earlier, there's already recognition that safety is a concern for parents when it comes to choosing destinations. And what literature has shown is that there are oftentimes specific safety concerns associated with specific countries. So for instance, when parents and students talk about the USA, oftentimes there's concerns raised about potential racial discrimination against Asians, rising social and political unrest, and also targeting of Muslim students after 9/11. But oftentimes, the scholarship also notes that parents are less concerned about safety when it comes to their sons going overseas for study. This thinking being that that's part of what it means to become a man, that you have to face and overcome risk. But as I mentioned earlier, there are also safety concerns when it comes to studying within South Asia itself. So thinking of South Asia as a destination, this could also be seen as a dangerous destination for a lot of parents, especially when it comes to sending their daughters to study in South Asia. And for Indian female students, actually, there's scholarship that shows that studying overseas actually makes them feel more safe. In general, there's also increasing interest in the role of parents in international student migration and an acceptance that parents actually play an important role, not just in terms of paying the bills, but also acting as a compass in directing their children to different places. But this literature tends to only have two main framings for parental involvement. Parents are either positioned as the boosters, as we put it, or the planners of their children's mobility, where they are heavily invested in charting out their children's life for their children, or they're presented as a barrier to their children's migration dreams, where the children, oftentimes daughters, have to negotiate with their parents to convince their parents to support their migration aspirations and also pay for it. There's not enough substantive discussion within the literature about how parents really try to balance both their goals as well as their concerns, especially when it comes to their daughters, which again is something that we wanted to look at in our project. So to tell you a little bit about how we went about the project, this paper is part of a larger project on South Asian expatriate parent university dreams for their children who were raised in the UAE. We took a mixed methods approach where we conducted an online survey of 110 South Asian parents. We then did follow-up interviews with 32 of them. We also conducted a small number of interviews with 4 educational consultants based in the UAE whose clientele are mainly South Asian parents living in the UAE. And it's really quite remarkable how much the education consulting business has just really mushroomed over the last few years in the UAE. And we also conducted participant observation at the multiple university fairs and university open houses that happen every year in the UAE. I should note that I am the mother of a high school age child, so the participant observation was also very personally useful for me, and we brought the whole family along, and so it was a lot of fun. But that's a separate paper. The eligibility criteria are mentioned here. And what I will say about during the interviews, what we were really interested in was exploring parents' attitudes towards different destination countries, their ambitions for their children. And we asked all of the interviewees if safety had factored in their decision making. But importantly, we left it open to parents to tell us what kind of safety fears they had. And this open-ended approach was really important because it helped us realize that there were very geographically specific security concerns that parents had, rather than a generic, universal kind of fear. So to give you a brief overview of our survey sample, the vast majority of our interviewees were from India. Most of our respondents were also were women with an average age of 45. Most of them had 2 or more children. And interestingly enough, just over half had a master's degree or higher. And this was actually really interesting because we link this with parents' emphasis on their children's education and their often unquestioned assumption that their child was going to pursue an undergraduate degree, and not even that, also get a master's degree at some point, and that this really did shape their view of what their child's future was going to look like. There was significant income diversity within our sample, which was really helpful as well. And over half of the sample had lived in the country for over 15 years. So these were people who had children born in the UAE, who had lived in the UAE their entire lives, or from when they were very, very young. And so their sense of the UAE as home was also very, very important. Also interesting was that about 2/3 of our sample had at least one child currently in high school thinking about university, while 30% already had a child who was in an undergraduate program in the UAE or overseas, while 17% of survey respondents had a child who had completed their undergraduate studies. And this distribution was really important, again, because it was helpful for us to allow us to distinguish between respondents' stated preferences versus their revealed preferences when it came to where they were sending their children. So rather than just asking them, oh, where would you like to send your child, we actually were able to ask them, where did you send your child? And as you will see, this was really helpful in helping us see if there were gender differences or not in destination. So this is the big reveal. When it came to the survey sample, if we focus only on the parents who had a child who was either in university or had graduated already from university, which was 48 parents, what we found was that when we divided up destinations into 3 broad categories, Western countries, because that was really the only overseas destination that parents were sending their children to, the UAE or the origin country, what we found was that a higher proportion of daughters, 55%, were sent to universities in the West compared to sons, where only 42% of sons were being sent to Western universities. Conversely, a slightly higher proportion of sons were being sent to universities in the UAE or the origin country. Now, we wanted to see whether or not this was statistically significant, and so we ran a Fisher's exact test. And what we found was that there was no statistically significant association between gender and destination. And what we interpret that to mean is that daughters were not disadvantaged, even though in our sample they have a higher proportion. Statistically speaking, there was no disadvantage or advantage between daughters and sons when it came to university destination decision making, which we thought was really quite interesting. Now, when we shifted to the interviews, we found a similar pattern in the interviews where, and we had 4 broad findings from our interviews. The first was a very strong current of gender egalitarianism in how parents, and particularly mothers, were talking about their children's educational futures, where they emphasized they did not want to play favorites in terms of the resources they were giving their sons versus their daughters. At the same time, alongside that, there was a clear narrative of gender protectionism in their intervention in what we call their daughters' sub-migration decisions, which I'll talk about in a little bit. The third finding from the interviews was as the literature shows, this clear sense that there are different ways in which different destinations are constructed in parents' minds as more or less safe. And we found remarkable consistency across parents in terms of how they talked about different country safety levels, leading us to arrange them in what we call a spectrum of safety. And then the final finding was that even as parents talked about being worried about their daughter's safety, they simultaneously used a narrative that previously has really only been applied to sons, which is this idea that daughters needed to be exposed to some danger as well in order to help them become more independent and resilient. And in this way, what our interviews did was capture this tightrope that our parent interviewees were walking as they tried to balance their university dreams and fears for their daughters. So what I'm going to do now is get deeper into each one of these findings from the interviews. So the first finding, as I said, was the idea that many of the parents, and particularly the mothers, were adamant that their daughters should have the same educational opportunities as their sons. So Arti, who has a girl and a boy, her daughter is currently studying in the USA, indicated that within the South Asian community in the UAE, in the past, there used to be this tradition of not sending the daughters overseas, but that has kind of dissipated over time. That she has seen very conservative families even sending daughters to countries in the West. Similarly, Shreya, who has two daughters, both studying in the UK, said, I have no inhibition at all, absolutely no inhibition to send them away. Meanwhile, Rana, who has two children, a boy who's the younger one and a daughter who's currently studying in Canada, talked about her own experience growing up, where she had been not able to pursue all of her passions and interests because her mother wouldn't let her do things that were boy things to do. So she talked about how she really wanted to play cricket, but her mother wouldn't let her play cricket because that was what boys did and not girls did, and how she had decided, when I become a parent, I won't allow this type of patriarchal things in my children's life. And so she was very proud of the fact that she was not having any difference in treatment of her daughter versus her son. In contrast, it was the fathers we interviewed or that we heard about who appeared to be much more nervous about their daughter studying overseas, which was a really interesting dynamic that, again, I don't think gets explored enough within the literature. So Manasi, who only has one child, a daughter, she was complaining about her husband, who in earlier years had been fine with sending their daughter to the UK to study. They had taught the University of Sussex. That was the place they wanted to send their daughter. It was safe. That was our plan. But now my husband is talking about the UAE just because he doesn't want to let his little princess away from his side. And so she was laughing about how she's the one who has to push her husband to say, no, look, we can send her overseas. It's going to be fine. Latif, meanwhile, has three children. His oldest is studying in the UAE, a boy, and his middle child, a girl. He was very concerned about sending her to study overseas because she wears a hijab, and he was very worried about potential religious discrimination that she might face. And so he said, I don't think we're considering anything outside of the UAE. We don't really get into how religion inflects destination decision making in this paper, but we have some ideas about it, and I'm happy to talk about it during the Q&A if anyone is interested. But in general, we didn't find that religion, and in this case, I mean being Muslim, made parents more reluctant about sending their daughters overseas. It in fact affected both sons and daughters, where Muslim parents in general were more likely to just want to keep their children in the UAE. Now, balancing off the gender egalitarianism that we heard from most of the parents was this undercurrent of gender protectionism, where even though parents were willing to send their daughters overseas, what we saw again and again was this pattern of parental intervention in these much more micro decisions around the living arrangements their daughters would have to live within, choosing the countries that they would study overseas, choosing the particular cities and universities such that there would be family nearby in case of an emergency, or choosing locations where they could have direct flights from the UAE. And so we call these sub-migration decisions to point to how, when we think about the role of gender in influencing international student migration, we need to perhaps move away from only focusing on, do the daughters get to go overseas or not, but rather focusing on this much more granular level of decision making where parents are much more interventionist when it came to their daughters as compared to their sons. So Lizzie, for instance, talked about how she had not wanted her daughter to go to Canada. She said Canada was too far. Maybe for your graduate studies you can go that far, but for now let's try somewhere closer. And so she was very happy when her daughter ended up getting accepted into a university in the Netherlands. But then came the concern about, okay, what's the living arrangement going to be? And she was living in a shared flat with some other female students. But Lizzie's fear was that there were going to be men coming and going. And so what she said was, one thing, she has to have a room with an attached bathroom. I don't know if I would have been that particular if it was a boy, but with a girl, I said, nothing doing. The rent, whatever we pay, we have to pay, but the bathroom has to be attached. If she has to use a washroom at night, I want it to be a safe space. So Lizzie was upfront about the fact that she didn't know how she would behave if she had a son. She only had the one daughter, but it was very clear in how she talked that she linked it to her daughter's safety. The other thing that she also said was that, and this is in the very first line of the quote, where she said, there'll be men coming, there'll be boys coming, we have no control over it. And the question here is it control over her daughter or control over the environment in which her daughter is in? And when we probed her about this, she actually insisted that it was about control over the environment, that she insisted that she had a lot of trust and faith in her daughter. She saw her daughter as very independent, but it was much more about trying to control the environment that their daughters would be in when they were overseas. Disha, meanwhile, talked about choosing Reading over Nottingham because Reading was much closer to Heathrow and she didn't want her daughter to have to go through multiple transfers to get to university. And Dimple, who has two daughters studying in the US, talked about why they liked the University of Pittsburgh because that just happened to be a city where they had a close family friend 12 minutes drive away from the university campus. And Dimple actually later on in her interview talked about how this ended up being a wonderful decision because when her daughter fell sick in her first year, this family friend was able to bring home-cooked chicken soup right to her daughter's doorstep. And this was a vindication for Dimple that she had made the right decision to help her daughter. So along these lines, the third finding that we noticed was this consistency in how parents talked about different countries' safety levels, but always with the UAE as their reference point. So again and again, we heard parents speak about the UAE as incredibly safe and how much they appreciated the sense of security and peace of mind that the country gave them. Only one other country was deemed to be as safe as the UAE, and that was Singapore, which again was mentioned as this incredibly safe place. The next set of countries that were deemed safe enough by parents were a range of Northern European countries. Canada was in the mix. Australia, interestingly enough, was also in the mix. Slightly less safe, sorry for all of the people in the UK. The UK was listed as less safe, largely due to its reputation for having a relatively high incidence of robberies and knife crimes. And then way at the other end of the spectrum, and this again was really surprising to us, was not just the USA, but also India. And so these are two countries which you don't oftentimes see in the same category, but parents consistently talked about both of these places as very, very unsafe. The USA was mentioned as unsafe because of gun safety issues. I should point out that we did all of our interviews before the second Trump administration. And we are really hoping to do new interviews to see how things have changed or maybe gotten worse. But the issue of gun safety was the theme that was raised multiple times by parents as why they were nervous about the United States. With India, instead, what the safety concerns were around substance abuse. So parents talked again and again about the dangers of exposure to drugs and drug addiction that they had heard so many stories about coming from India and particularly Indian campuses, and then also sexual harassment concerns. So I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but these were some of the things that parents were saying about the US on the one hand, and then also India on the other hand. The fourth theme that came out of the interviews was this idea that this acknowledgement that their safety concerns should not be something that serves as a roadblock for their children's aspirations. So even as all of the parents praised the UAE's high safety levels, it wasn't as if they overwhelmingly decided to send their children to the UAE. From the data that we have, it was clear that UAE was very attractive to many parents, but they were willing to overcome their fears of danger in other countries because this was something that their children aspired to. And the narrative that we heard from parents was this idea that too much safety could also be a drawback. And these parents adopted a narrative that exposing their children, and particularly their daughters, to some danger by having them study outside of the UAE was actually good for them. So parents shared a very common concern that their children were too coddled from having grown up in the UAE. So a very common refrain was this idea that their children were book smart but not street smart, that if they sent them back to India, they would be eaten alive by Indian students who could really be much tougher and would bully these pampered UAE-raised children. But also if they send them to the West, even though there was some danger there, it would actually help them develop all of their senses that were essential for surviving in these societies. So Shreya, who has her daughters in the UK, said, as a parent, I always fear for their safety, but a human being has to learn to take care of themselves. We're not going to be around forever. And so as a mother, to just always be scared that something will go wrong and something will happen to their child is not correct. At some point, you have to let your children learn to take care of themselves. And so Rana, for instance, whose daughter is in Canada, also said, my fears won't be I don't want my fears to be a barrier for her dreams. And her daughter had a really severe case of harassment during her first year in Canada, which had terrified Rana. But again, she talked about how I can't let this stop me from letting her pursue her education in Canada. So it's not that I'm not afraid, but I need to get over it. So what are the implications of all of this? What we argue in the paper is that parents care deeply about their children's safety in both gendered and ungendered ways. So in ungendered ways, they believed in the equality of opportunity for both of their children, that they shouldn't let their safety concerns hold them back from letting their daughters go overseas as well as their sons. But in gendered ways, we saw the amount of gendered attention that parents were putting into these sub-migration decision-making decisions when it came to their daughters studying overseas. And so it was this struggle that we saw again and again with parents trying to balance their gender egalitarian principles with that protectionist impulse. So what we hope this paper is doing is contributing to the literature by acknowledging that parents are often juggling these fears and aspirations at the same time. They're not one or the other. And that gender operates in much more subtle ways in international student migration beyond the question of are the girls going and studying overseas or not. We have to think much more deeply than that. At the same time, we acknowledge these limitations. The UAE is a very unusual case, and our sample is rather small and somewhat privileged as well. So we weren't running any big regression analysis. We also maybe don't have the full class spectrum represented within our sample. And then in terms of future research, what we are hoping to do this summer is to do more surveys and interviews with parents, but also with the children to really understand how, to kind of triangulate how do the household negotiations actually work. We've only heard from one side of the equation now, but we're hoping to do more interviews with children. And then also, as I mentioned earlier, try to dig more into the role of religion into these decision-making processes. But I will stop there. And the paper is out. It was published in Migration Studies last month, so it's open access. So please read the paper, and I would love to hear your questions and comments. Thank you.
Absolutely brilliant, Anju. Thank you so much. I don't know if you could see my face while you were speaking, but I was nodding furiously throughout your talk. Very excited to hear your findings here, and maybe in some ways revisit some of the very things that I also observed, but never got a chance to dig deeper into as you have. While I was in the UAE, it's been I think I was last there 10 years ago.
You've got to come back.
I would very much love to continue the work. Wow, this is fantastic because we also have questions pouring in, and I don't want to get in the way of that. But I do want to just quickly, if I may, just ask, in terms of maybe this is methodological, but where you spoke to you had your demographics of survey respondents. In that list, I didn't see anything about the amount of time that the participants had lived in the UAE. So I was just curious about how that might, maybe I missed that, but does that bear on the types of responses that they might have given you? And does it reflect on sort of their their sense of middle-class modernity as experienced as like a long-term UAE resident, and do they identify as that? Or do they still see themselves as South Asian expatriate foremost, and are speaking from that part of their identities?
It's a great question, Lee. And in the paper we have in the paper we have the breakdown of their duration in the UAE. So I'll tell you, almost 30% of participants had been in the UAE over 20 years. Another 30% had been in the UAE between 16 to 20 years. And so we have some, about 7%, who have been in the UAE less than 5 years, but the vast majority are long-term residents. And there was this sense, not in this paper, we don't talk about it, but in the other paper a little bit, where we highlight how the longer the child has been in the UAE, the more it feels like home for them. And so there's also the sense amongst the children that I want to stay in the UAE. While for the children who had not been in the UAE as long, there was less of that sense of connection and more of a willingness to either go back to their origin country to study or to go somewhere else. So definitely, you're absolutely right that the duration of residence did play a role.
Okay. Yes, it just gave me a sense of whether, those who, the longer they spend there, see themselves as sort of not Emirati, sorry, but sort of long-term residents of the UAE, and therefore some kind of cosmopolitans that have an entitled mobility to places around the world, versus more of a restricted sense of like bilateral mobility between the UAE and their home country or somewhere else.
I see. I think that was much more about their class positionality then, not so much about the time in the UAE, but definitely there were people like that.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks. Sorry. Let's get to the participants here, and I suppose we could just go in the order that they've come in. We have one from Ian first. Ian, would you like to put your question to Anju yourself? If you can't, I'm happy to read it out for you. I don't see Ian's camera on. And so I'll just go ahead and read it out to you. So Ian's asking about here. Ian's asking about do you mean, I'm trying to understand his question here. In the UAE, not of the UAE, when you speak of the universities, given the number of international campuses involved, So study in the UAE may well be with a Western university using English as the common language.
Sorry, I found my mic. I've tried 3 times.
There you are,
different
Ian.
mics. Can you hear
Good
me?
you can join us. I'm not sure I understood your question.
Okay. You said early on that 85% of the universities were not UEA state, or you said they were private, and many of them were from Western countries. So in fact, people could go to university in the UEA, but be in an offshore campus from many Western universities. Is that right?
Exactly.
It changes some of the factors in the decision making of that. So
Without a doubt.
they were actually studying at home, but the foreigners had come to them rather than them having to go to the foreigners.
Yes. Exactly. So
Oh,
I'll tell you some of the top universities that our interviewees' children were studying in, if they had chosen the UAE as a destination. So it was Heriot Watt, which has a campus in Dubai. The American University of Sharjah, which is a private university, New York University Abu Dhabi, which is my institution, it's an American university, Middlesex University, Dubai, University of Birmingham, Dubai. So all of these are private branch campuses of one kind or another, and it was precisely that that is what appealed to them, that they could get a Western degree, oftentimes at a lower cost, while potentially one of the things that these universities have started to do much, much more is offer an international component to their degree offerings. So you can study, for instance, the first 2 years in the UAE, and then for your final year, you can go and study in the main campus in the UK, or you can move around within the global network of the university and study in different campuses. And this has become really appealing to a lot of UAE families where they postpone their children's departure by a couple of years when they feel like the child is going to be a little bit more mature. But it still gives the child a sense that, oh, I get some of my international exposure, while most of it is still within the safe confines of the UAE itself. So it has become a very popular approach to go to these international branch campuses with a kind of 2+1 model.
can I just do a follow-up with that? You've talked about the parents, you talk about them, the decision, and it's the parents. What about the autonomy of the daughters? Did they have any choice in this, or are they doing what they're told?
I mean, that's really what that's what the follow-up study is, to talk to the daughters and sons from the same families and kind of triangulate between them. But one of the things that and again, this I think has to be a separate paper, was just the sheer variety, the range in approaches that families take. Some of the people we interviewed, it was really the parents who were doing pretty much all of the planning. And then there were others where parents were saying, look, our child is doing it all. We pay, we sign the check, but they've kind of handled it. And they were quite proud about this too. They were saying how, look, they're really independent. They did all of the research. They came and presented to us what their options were. And we had everybody in between as well. So it was, I hesitate to say there was one approach, but it was clear that this is a family project in many ways.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Just on that matter of branch campuses enabling like a short-term visit or a half and half study. My understanding was that a lot of students don't actually take that up. They tend to either study entirely in the UAE or study entirely in a home campus, but it's quite rare the take up of something in between. Was that your?
I have to go back and look at
Yeah.
the data, Lee. I
Yeah.
don't know if we asked everyone consistently. I know in the interviews, quite a few people talked about it as something that that their child was going to do.
Yeah.
But you're right. I think people might change their opinion. There was a lot of people who talked about how they ended up forming a really strong community within the Dubai campus, and so this idea of maybe studying overseas for their senior year, it might dissipate because they don't want to leave their
Yeah,
friends.
that's right. Yeah.
But I don't actually know for sure. So
Okay.
I can believe that happens, but maybe it also there's enough people moving around too.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Okay, great. Thank you. We've got a question from Usman. Has an interesting question about the differences between interviews and your participant observation work and the education fairs. Usman, do you want to ask yourself?
Yeah, sure thing. Firstly, thank you for the very
Oh,
insightful talk.
I'm very sorry.
And
It's Samad, isn't it?
yeah, that's correct. That's completely fine. Thank
My
you,
apologies.
No, that's fine. So within mothers and fathers thinking differently, did these gender differences emerge mainly in the interviews, or did you also see them play out at your participant observation and educational fairs? Essentially, who spoke, who asked the questions, and who seemed to make decisions within those processes?
Such a great question. Thank you so much, Samad. So maybe this is not surprising, but it was mainly mothers. There was across the board, there seemed to be an allocation of responsibilities where it was the mothers who were much more involved in the conversations with the child, even doing some of the research. There would oftentimes be mothers going with the children to the university fairs. There'd still be fathers, but I think the mothers were the ones who were oftentimes asking more of the questions. What was also interesting was the parents asked different questions compared to the children. So there was some interesting dynamics going on there where oftentimes as the parents were saying, oh, can you get a residence visa afterwards? What are the career opportunities? And the students are not interested in that. They're not asking those questions. So there's also intergenerational differences, but oftentimes it was seen as the mother's responsibility. The money was oftentimes the father's responsibility. And so whenever it was a financial conversation, the father would be more involved. But in terms of these much more granular decisions, it was the mother who was much more the initiator.
Understood. Could I ask a very quick follow-up, if that's okay? That would be, how did those families then negotiate the tensions between student aspiration and then the risk element of the parents? And what kinds of arguments or evidence tended to win within that family tension?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where I really want to talk to the children as well, because I think with the parents, we didn't necessarily get too much into conflict situations, but I think the children will have a different point of view entirely. But with the parents, and again, large because we interviewed primarily mothers, there was the sense that it was a negotiation where it was, look, these are the options. This is my concern. Can we do this instead? And it was very much of a back and forth. But until we hear from the children, I'm not 100% sure if we have the full picture.
Understood. Thank you.
Right. Yes, you've got a lot of different directions from which to triangulate some data. Great. Okay. Thank you. Let's go over to Professor Verghese. You had your hand up.
Thank you very much. Firstly, it was a very crystal clear presentation. I want to congratulate. I had two concerns. One is very minor, the other is slightly more important. One is that 86% of your response are females. The over concern for safety, is it because of the one-sided or overwhelmingly one-sided, not one-sided, overwhelmingly one-sided responses from the females, because mothers are more concerned about the safety? I'm not saying fathers are not concerned. Mothers are more concerned about the safety. Because let me also say that I'm a board member of the UAE branch campuses for the last 8 years. So I come to and visited many of the institutions. But what I get as a sense when we interact with the students, not with the parents, with the students, is that employment opportunity is a major concern. I have written and published about it in my articles on internationalization, because why students are going in large numbers, even from India, the largest number of students are going to United States, which you characterize as the dangerous one. Because there is a trade-off between safety versus employment opportunities. And because this is a globalized world, it's a market-mediated migration that you are talking about. So if you are investing money, you want to get the returns. So the returns are higher when you go to UK or USA or Canada or Australia than going to UAE, you know. So I don't know whether your research did not show anything about this aspect of choosing UAE or not choosing UAE, which I feel is not in line with what we normally see in the international literature and empirical studies. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for both of those questions. So with regard to the first one, in many ways, that's what you would expect, right? That this is the narrative that mothers are more concerned about safety, and so that's why they're raising it. But what we found from the interviews was the opposite. At least, again, this is self-reported, but it's the mothers saying, I don't want to let that be the reason why I don't allow my daughter to go overseas. And instead, it's the fathers who are expressing more concerns about their daughters studying overseas. So it was, to us, a very surprising and interesting contradiction there. That I think speaks to how we cannot assume that it's going to be mothers who are holding their daughters back, that the intergenerational transmission of some of these norms can actually be broken. And is it because these are parents who are in the UAE and not back in their home countries, and so already have more freedom to be thinking about different ways in which to do gender? I suspect that that's part of what's going on. It's also likely because these tend to be much more educated women. And we already know from India data, at least from India data, I don't know about other South Asian countries, that it tends to be higher income. So Indian families who are sending their daughters overseas. So it could be a class dynamic. It could be an overseas expatriate dynamic, but I think it's very interesting that it was actually the mothers and not the fathers who were speaking about sending their daughters overseas. So that's to the first point. The second point that you raised, so you're absolutely right. Safety is not the only consideration. And looking at things like the return on investment, the employment opportunities, the residency opportunities is absolutely critical. And so we're not trying to make a claim that safety is going to be the factor that will completely rule out certain countries. That being said, at least within our sample, and I'm just pulling out the other paper so I can be more precise about this. So within our sample, if we look at the individual Western countries that people were sending their children to, and this is for daughters and sons, the UAE was the single most popular destination. 35% of our sample had sent their child to a UAE university. The next most popular was the UK. So congratulations, UK. And then 16.7% had sent them to their home country. And then came the USA, and then the fifth most popular was Canada. So the UK was actually twice as popular as the US, at least within our sample. And granted, it's not representative, but the explanations that parents were giving about the UK was it was oftentimes a 3-year degree versus a 4-year degree in the US, so it was significantly cheaper. It was closer. It was seen as much safer. There were multiple reasons why people were a little more wary about the US. And the families who were sending their kids to the US tended to be of a slightly higher socioeconomic strata because, again, they felt like it was worth it. But I think, and again, this is why we want to do more field work over the summer. I think what's happening in the US right now has only made the US less popular. But again, that's an empirical question, and I wanna find an answer to it.
Super. Okay.
Follow-up question? Can I have a follow-up question?
Yes, if it's quick, only because we only have 6 more minutes with Anju.
Okay. No, my only request is that since it's a very interesting empirical study that you're carrying out, I'll be happy why your empirical evidence is different from the major trend of at least the Indian students going abroad. So that is my concern because this does not align with the available trend. And therefore, one is looking at it more cautiously. And you may be absolutely right. I am not questioning you have done the research. I am not questioning this, but I also have done quite a bit of research in this area. But my understanding of this is very at variance with your finding. Maybe partly because the interviews are held amongst the parents who are living in Dubai now or in UAE now. So for them, the college education or education UAE is an extension of their schooling.
I see.
Which is an important factor, So therefore, I feel that there is a little more factors to be considered before you push with this finding. That's all. Thank you. Sorry for intervening.
No, I mean, maybe we can take this offline, and I put my email address. I can put it in the chat, but maybe we can take it offline, because I'd love to talk more about it. And that applies to anybody else as well. Okay.
Yes, and we'll also share a link to your paper shortly.
Perfect. Thank you.
So, given that we're short on time, I'm going to jump right over to David in the room. If there are other questions that David, do you and others in the room want to ask anything? I'm trying to unmute you, and I'm not seeing the button. In fact, I don't have control over the unmute, David.
That.
Oh, there we go.
I'm unmuted, but I've created an echo. I'm really sorry. I think I might have to leave it. Pass it on.
I can see your question, David, which I thought was a really interesting one. So I can just read it out for people. You mentioned the concern about temporariness initially, but did that come up in your interviews? To what extent is the UAE seen as existentially uncertain, even if safe in physical terms? It's a great question. And I really, so again, we have another paper that I think the title is very clever, but maybe others will disagree. It's called The Inheritance of Transience. And is really speaking to this idea that this is an existential question for the parents, that I have raised my child in a country that they can never call home, that they will never be able to be a citizenship of. What have I done? They feel like they're in their country, but it's not their country. And so for a lot of parents, this was always at the back of their minds. But one of the things that we found was, and actually speaks to Lee's point at the very beginning, that for a lot of these young people, because they have lived and grown up in the UAE, they see it as their home, and they are willing to put up with a degree of temporariness that their parents don't actually want to bequeath to them. And so we found this really interesting split between the parents who oftentimes were saying, okay, look, at some point you're going to have to leave and find another country to call home. And the children are like, no, actually, even if we go overseas, we want to come back to the UAE. The UAE is our home. And so this tension between generations and how education, again, kind of plays into that, those education decisions play into it, was really fascinating to us. But that's a working paper. I would be happy to share it and get some feedback, because it was very surprising to us to hear the disappointment in parents' narratives, where they say, I kept telling my children, you're temporary here, you're not permanent here, you need to leave at some point. And the child would be like, no, I'm okay, I want to stay here. So it was fascinating.
That's
but
so
again,
interesting.
it speaks to,
Thank you.
it speaks to, yeah, I could go on about that paper. Sorry. Back to this one.
Great. Thank you, David. Thank you, Anju. We have two more questions here, both methodological. And if it's okay with Carol and Tasnova, I might just read them out. Because, well, the first one, Carol's asking about whether you found a difference in the respondents whose children who were in or had graduated from university, and those who had children who were still pre-university, firstly. And the second one, Tasnova's question pertains to the demographic makeup of your sample, whereby 80% of them were Indian participants. And so she's questioning whether this fairly represents South Asians as a whole. and whether if you had other South Asians more strongly represented in your sample, if that would change your findings in some way.
So again, two really excellent questions. I'll tackle the second one first, if that's okay. So this is what we had when we were getting reviewers for the paper. This is what they said as well. Like, should you just call it a paper about Indian expatriate parents? Is it fair to call it a paper about South Asian parents? And we pushed back very politely and said, no, we think it applies to all South Asian parents, but absolutely, I wish we had more other nationalities in the mix. I don't think it would make that much of a difference. I think, again, this is where religion comes into play, and also social class. That it's a class story. What we found, it was incredible, the difference in the. So when we compared again, the split between families that send their kids to the West versus the UAE versus the origin country, the average household income of the families who sent their kids to universities in the West was double the average income of households who sent their kids to a UAE university, and 4 times higher than the average income of families who sent their kids to a university in the origin country. This is not surprising, but the degree of difference was really quite stark to us. And I suspect that when it comes to Pakistani and Bangladeshi families, we'll see a similar class dynamic. But then religion, I think, also is going to be a big factor as well. So we really want to dig more into how religion influences us, and maybe through that we can find more Pakistani and Bangladeshi parents. Then to Carol's question, the pre and post, if you will, university parents, it's a really interesting question. And Lee will, I think, appreciate this. The higher education sector in the UAE is changing so quickly. And so one of the things that we're seeing is the role of COVID and how COVID, because in general, the UAE handled COVID really well and got out of its lockdown very quickly. UAE universities benefited a lot from parents who had children in high school during COVID, who then said, look, if anything goes wrong, I want my child to be safe. Why not put them in a UAE university? And so you see this difference between parents whose children are in high school who are now thinking about the UAE universities in a way that earlier cohort of parents were just not thinking about at all. So there's a steady increase in popularity of UAE universities. That being said, UAE universities are also becoming more and more expensive. So in response to that popularity, they've been upping their fees. And Eastern European universities, again, we were surprised by how many parents were talking about universities in the Czech Republic, in Poland, and countries that had not been on our radar at all as places that they were looking into for sending their children, where the price of those universities, the sticker price was about the same as the top universities in the UAE. And so parents were saying, look, I might as well send them to Prague because it'll cost the same as having them in the UAE itself, but they get a Western education and a Western degree. So it's really fascinating. It's this rapidly evolving sector. And yeah, I should.
And quite interesting. Quite interesting how the concept of Western university is expanding and capturing new markets. I mean, Eastern Europe wouldn't normally be lumped into that, but that imaginary.
Yeah.
But as you said, all these competitive pressures and are pushing parents in new directions. But also maybe with the new Trump dynamics, pushing against the traditional markets of Western international education.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it'd be interesting to find as well some follow-ups in the era of Trump 2.0, and just to see how vastly the global mobility landscape is shifting in terms of perceptions of safety and gender.
Yes.
Great. Okay, I think we do have to leave it there. I regrettably, because I think we could easily go on with quite. I certainly have many more questions for you. I'll have to take them offline. And likewise, I think others. Anju has shared her email address in the chat, and so please do put further questions to her. If I'm assuming that's okay with you, Anju.
Yes, absolutely. I would welcome it. Welcome it.
Great, and
Thank
also
you.
we've also linked your paper
Thank you.
with Sanam Parvani just out, and all looking forward to reading that. Thank you very, very much for sharing your work. It's super exciting to hear, and we hope to have you back, and as your work evolves.
That would be
Um,
lovely. And yes, thank you so much again, Lee and David, for giving me this opportunity to share this work. And thank you to everyone for all of your fantastic questions. I've taken screenshots of all the questions, so I can think about them over the next few days as well. But I really appreciate all of the really constructive questions and comments. Thank you.
Good. Likewise, yes. And there's a recording of this as well, which will be posted on the CG website shortly, in case you want to revisit any of the questions and answers. Okay.
Fantastic.
Well, thank you so much, Anju. And we look forward to seeing you again. David, any announcements that you would like to make before we close?
Next week, John Douglas, evidence on engagement. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.